Good afternoon. We are seamlessly moving into a chat show format that we've just devised, whereby I interview Tim, who is on my far right. Tim spent 20 years at the BBC working for Radio 2 in television for the London 2012 Olympics, then moved to the British Museum, back to the BBC briefly, now works and co-runs an independent production company.
Brilliant. And to my left, this is a format that will be available for purchase after. To my left is Tobi Olujinmi. Tobi originally trained as a lawyer, New York bar, moved to London, worked in commercial law, contact with the media industry, and realised there was a huge amount of money to make and Christian influence to have in the changing world of digital media and distribution. So now runs WTALK, which is an amazing content agency, so starting to be channels, subscriber channels, and particularly looking at female entrepreneurship, female empowerment. It is a huge growth sector, so Tobi runs that and is at the beginning of the WTALK explosion.
And I'll introduce to the lovely Christopher Landau. He is a former news reporter. He most recently, before he went on to his most recent job, was the religious correspondent for World Service, but now he's part of the clergy team, should I say, at St Aldate's in Oxford. So, but still does a lot of reporting, news reporting as well, as long with what he's doing now. Broadcasting, yeah.
Brilliant. We are a multi-talented team, as you can see. We thought, though, we'd ask you a question to start with, and I wonder if you put your hand in the air if you're doing now what you thought you might be doing at this stage in your life. Everyone has to vote. You've got to be brave. We're amongst friends. So hands in the air for those who thought, I'm definitely doing the thing I thought I'd be doing at this point in my life. Okay. How many is that? I'm half up, as it were. There's a lady there who's fairly positive. You're a bit, I'm sure. Very good, sir. So that's, okay, that's kind of interesting. What I'd quite like you to do then is just say a bit more of that to the person who's next to you. And if you're not physically next to someone, you can form a 3, form a 4. If you get to 5, it gets unmanageable, you see. So why don't you just turn to the person next to you and just, why didn't you? See, my hand was half up, you see, but, what was it you thought you'd be doing? And has it all been a terrible, terrible disappointment? Or has it all been a beautiful surprise? So why don't you just share a bit of that and talk to one another for 30 seconds?
So I'm sure you're all, engrossed in conversation about, I suppose, what we're going to explore a little bit more today in our session. And that's, the interesting fact that not many of us in the room are actually doing now what we thought we would be doing. I mean, I know for myself personally, I wanted to be a ballerina when I was young, and that went out the window. Went around the doctor's year. And then as I approached the 20s, I honestly thought that I would be a lawyer. And as I sit here today, I'm a non-practicing lawyer. And I think for most of us, in this current climate, and we'll be talking about a lot more in this panel, is, I suppose, the notion for job for life arguably is dead, I know my parents, my mum's been a pharmacist probably since the uterus, and that's her life. That's what she's a consultant pharmacist. She climbed the rank, and that's what she knows to do. But certainly now we've got this sort of, and I suppose where faith, the interesting intersection with faith as well, is this notion of calling and purpose and these things that we want to explore, and whether that can, I suppose, be boxed into a 9-to-5 job or whether people find their purpose in that. And then on another flip side is the fact that I suppose, Tim, we're multifaceted people, so we've got so many different arms to us, and now more than ever people want to explore that. And I suppose as a result, people can have maybe 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 different sort of career paths. I mean, what's your thoughts on it? Do you think is that a good thing? Is that something that for today we...
Yeah, I suppose automatically we think it's a good thing. I was with my 80-year-old father yesterday, who, and we had the day in London, and we were talking about his life. And he did the same job for 40 years. He joined the post office, but to start telephone working, and that became British Telecom. And he retired after 40 years. And the thing he wanted to be was an English teacher. But,
oh, wow.
There's no way he was on a route from school to engineering, and he became an engineer and joined the post office, and there were 3 boys, and we all needed food and clothes, and he was of that generation where he just sacrificed. Well, what it was he wanted to do, which was this great passion for English literature, well, that went on the back burner while he supported this family in Sussex.
Yeah.
And he was lucky to take early retirement, and his working life flourished from the moment he took early retirement. He retired not far after 50 and is a prison visitor, teaches English to refugees, was part of the Citizens Advice Bureau. Yeah. And so he has flourished and had this amazing set of careers after that. And so I suppose automatically we think it's quite nice now that we're not pigeonholed into doing one career for life, and that also there are phases in our lives and chapters in our lives, and that work might be able to support that, both paid work and unpaid work. The only thing, we were chatting a bit earlier, and I suppose, Toby, the only thing that struck me was there was at least a simplicity to Dad's life, knowing, he was in a company for life, there was a pension, there'd be a day he retired, they knew every week of the year they went on holiday, whereas I'm, hoping to go away next week. That stopped because we're live broadcasting a gig next Wednesday, so the holiday's just gone on the back burner. I couldn't tell you what I'm going to be doing in 2 years' time. I couldn't be telling you whether I'll do in 10 years' time, and I can't tell you what my pension's going to look like. And so there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenge, as well as, I guess, where we get to automatically, which is it's a great thing that through our lives we might be able to reflect different careers. There we are. That's a very long answer to your question, Toby. Apologies.
No, but what I find interesting, I suppose this is, interesting in based on what you're doing now, Christopher, is like the uncertainty, because it absolutely does breed uncertainty. I suppose when I initially thought that I was going to be a lawyer, and I worked in the media space, and I was a commercial, and I worked with many entertainment and media brands, commercializing content. But I suppose I did have that kind of pull of the heart, not to be like emotional up here, but the pull of the heart that maybe perhaps I could do something more with the content, perhaps I could do something more with the media. But it's massively uncertain now because, the path is, but is that an opportunity, I suppose, where faith sort of, and I suppose we're almost forced to rely on something slightly bigger than ourselves, and it is great opportunity for faith. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, if that...
Yeah, I found a school exercise book from when I was 10 years old the other day, and the teacher at the beginning of the academic year had said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'd written a journalist, and I hadn't seen that for years and years. But actually, all the way through school, I wanted to run the school newspaper, or I actually was the first person in living memory not to be part of the hideous, in my opinion, combined cadet force at my school and set up a school newspaper instead. And for me, there was a very strong sense of being a Christian who was also in mainstream broadcasting and who was a journalist who was credible and who could pitch stories that got onto mainstream news programmes. But I happened to be a Christian. And for me, I thought that was going to be that was what my calling was going to look like. And then it was a much more sort of dramatic, unexpected intervention, I suppose, that made me challenge that. And we might go on to talk about that. But I think partly it's perhaps about being attentive to what is really feeding you and nurturing you, because I genuinely thought I would be a news journalist at the BBC for many, many years. But I had this very curious experience of feeling slightly underwhelmed getting the job as religion correspondent at the World Service. And I think because I was a Christian with due humility, although obviously to get on in any career like this, you have to knock on a few doors, but I had tried to do that with some semblance of humility and hadn't really admitted to myself that there were 2 jobs at the BBC I really wanted, and I'd suddenly got one at age 28. But it caused me to really reflect on, so why do I not feel as though this is it? So that was an intriguing thing to then go back to, well, what is really feeding or nurturing or nourishing me?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what's interesting is like what you again, it's that concept of what's feeding us. It's a little bit of a dichotomy there, because initially when we set up in education, and is that the driving force? Are those the questions that we're asking when we say I'm going to embark on a career as a journalist or in broadcast or a doctor or a lawyer? Are those questions? Is it a question of faith? Is it a question of calling? Or as you spoke about your father, is it a question of actually this is kind of what you do? And I think more in this time, we're being encouraged, I suppose maybe with technology, certainly with WTALK, what I'm doing now, is it even possible to do 10, 15 years ago? I mean, I'm not sure. I run a digital new media, platform, a streaming service. So arguably, other streaming services like Netflix and Amazon have, paved the way, if you like. But
what do your lawyer friends, when you say what you're
oh, well, they
now,
think I'm crazy.
do they?
Yeah, well, yeah, of course, because, initially they kind of think, well, I wasn't a bad lawyer, I was okay, I wasn't going to make, so it's kind of like I was on track to kind of go do what I passed the New York bar. I'd come back from New York, I'd come here, I was working with great kind of, contacts. I was building a client list. By no means was I the best associate at the firm, but I was okay. So I think for them, this is what you do. Certainly when I had a conversation with my mum, and I suppose it's an interesting conversation because what I'm doing now is difficult to explain. It's like, so are you Netflix? No. So are you a producer? Kind of. So, it's new. It's new, and I suppose for many people who go into second and third careers who don't, it's new pastures, isn't it? And like all sorts of change and stuff that is new, there's an element of fear there. And I think for my parents, the partner that when I spoke to him and said, actually, I think I'm gonna jump ship here. He kind of said, well, good luck, but I don't quite understand it. And I think that goes back to what you said about what's feeding us, because I think there has to be something bigger. There has to be like a call, or there has to be some sort of determination, or your why, should I say, has to be quite strong. And for me, my why was actually, I see that there's great media, I see that there's great content and opportunity to commercialise content, but I also see a massive underserved market, and I also see the narrative of faith in the mainstream, and there's a mismatch. And that's my why, so it drove me.
Understood. And who in the audience has made a major career change in their, what we call, and by working life we mean anything that is our general activity when we get out of bed in the morning and, between then getting back into bed, whatever that is. You don't have to, but I mean, hands in the air, anyone who's made a fairly major change. I mean, I did at one point. So that would sort of reflect where we are. I think we have a roving mic, because what I thought, this format, incidentally, is an absolute nightmare for the sound guys, because they don't know who's going to speak at any point. So they'll be glad that we'll never be trying this. We'll never be trying this again. I thought with a roving mic, Holly, what might be quite good is one thing that interests me is just that, because it's interesting, Tobi, when you shared the news, people were surprised or thought it's mad, where I think amazing, like fantastic. Yeah. But there's still quite a bit of snobbery. I mean, I don't know. Is it right? There's a bit of snobbery and a bit of, oh, right. I have a mate who used to work at the BBC who's just left the BBC to become a checkout person in Waitrose because they wanted a simpler life and wanted more time to read. And then sometimes I think, yeah. And of course, there's such similar organisations, it will just feel like moving next door. But actually, you think fantastic, but there's a part of you, I'm ashamed to say, there's a part of you which goes, ooh, it's a bit of a funny move, but actually, it's sort of right. So I wonder, for those people who, one brave example of someone who perhaps made a change and it was a bit challenging in terms of telling other people. So again, hands in the air for those who've made a change and who is going to be lovely and just share what that was like. Well, you, madam, thank you. Hello, what's your name?
Biddy.
Biddy, hi.
Okay, so I was working in a job that actually I hated, but I was doing bookkeeping. I became a Christian and God really challenged me. Gave up the bookkeeping. The day that I gave it up, he opened a new door into communication for me. Great, thank you. Who else has made a really big change? Thank you, Tobi. There's someone at the back. You, sir, with the blue shirt on. Thank you.
Yep. I've moved from ITV News locally, where I was on the telly most nights, to Bible Society. And try saying at dinner, I work for ITV News. Oh, yeah, I work for Bible Society. Right, okay, who do you work for?
Right.
Right? And 1 minute you're on the telly and you're a somebody, and the next minute you're Bible Society and you're probably just a nobody. None of those things really count, but it is interesting to go through that process, I think, to step a little bit out of the limelight. You know, I was a regional person on telly, so I wasn't a huge star or anything. But you step out of your little bit of limelight and you just think, yeah, this is a big change. I think that was
recognition in your local area than
possibly.
A lot of the national.
Is that the case?
Yeah, the research
right.
shows
Well,
that,
yes. And now people look at me like they think they know me, but they're not sure who I actually am. That's quite funny.
Has that been difficult at times?
Yeah, that was difficult at first. Yeah. Because people did know you. And in other ways, it was quite nice because I can go to the pub and nobody looks at me and asks me who I am. I think that's quite a challenge, and I think that was a God-given challenge, if you like. I think I spent a lot of time, like Christopher, thinking, I want to be a Christian in the media, and I did that, and I pitched my stories, and I got some of them on. And it was a bit of a shock to think God's now wanted me to actually do something else. Yeah. But when I was made redundant, my church minister said to me, yeah, you do need to do something with the Bible, but you don't want to be a church minister. We don't know what that is yet. And it became apparent. That's a whole other story.
What an encouraging story. Yeah.
It's quite a change, yeah.
Great. Thanks for sharing. Let's give a round of applause to both those guys. Thank you.
I suppose you wanted to talk about, in regards to mentors and new services and, you go into this new career, how does this kind of play out practically in terms of, do we get mentors? Do you, I suppose, in terms of what tips and advice would you be able to give and offer? Because I suppose there's some people that may be thinking, I want to do something new. And there may be people here that may be thinking, I want to do something new, but this is a whole new industry. This is a whole new, where and how do people start? I don't know, Chris, if you have any...
Well, I think in this seamless format, I've been asked to bring up the question of where does God's guidance, providence, fit in? Do we overplay it, underplay it? There's someone else in the audience who I'm particularly keen to hear from. Can we bring the mic to... So Suzanne Evans is here, who was a BBC journalist and then rose to prominence in UKIP, which is another way of, that's from one kind of public prominence to another kind of much more significant public prominence, I guess. But I think anything that you're willing to share would be amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting you talking about changing career. I mean, I've had several different... I started out, as you said, working as a journalist for the BBC. I then became a single mother, and I couldn't really carry on that job because, as you know, it's kind of, you go into the office in the morning, you never know where you're going to end up at lunchtime, and when you've got responsibilities and childcare and not much money working at the BBC, it's very difficult. So I then founded a PR and marketing consultancy, which did lots of things, but it specialised in working with religious organisations. And then politics, it happened quite by accident. And I think there is this providence thing, and, whatever you think of UKIP, and I have to say I'm no longer involved, it was a hell of a 2 years, and it was fascinating, particularly going through the Brexit process. And, what I really like, I think, is that these days it is acceptable to have that portfolio career. It can be difficult when you want to get back into employment, because sometimes I think some of the most entrepreneurial people in our society are discriminated against when it comes to actually getting back into some kind of full-time job. I think I've been self-employed for 28 out of my 30 working years. And I think I'm probably unemployable now, actually, for all sorts of different reasons. But if you have faith, there is something, I think, about just rolling with whatever God puts in front of you. And I've certainly always done that. For good or for ill. But it's been a ride. And now, of course, I'm wondering what to do next. So, any offers?
But I think that's it. I mean, the other thing that interests me, I am looking at the people who were here earlier on. Now, Sally Bundock, I didn't work with closely, but I certainly didn't know she was a Christian. And Darren Mackenzie and I did the same journalism training course together. And I'm thinking, did we ever have a conversation about faith? And I do remember once going along to the Christian Union at the BBC, and in a very sort of news journalist way, oh, I never know whether I'm here on a Tuesday lunchtime, you know, I can't possibly, you know, I work for the World at 1, you know, this kind of thing. And then say, oh, well, it's okay for you, you work in children's, and, you know, it's fine if you're, you know, dealing with fluffy bunnies all day, to then, you know, it's rather harder if you're a news journalist to kind of reconcile these two things. But for me, it was a rather unexpected kind of divine moment, as it were. I should say, I mean, I'm now at a church that, on the spectrum, as it were, would probably own the label charismatic. I hadn't seen Giles Fraser for a few years, and there were F words associated with his response to the church in Oxford, where I now am, in the sense that, the Anglican Church is a broad church, and when he was a chaplain in Oxford, he didn't necessarily always have entirely pleasant things to say. I mean, as we know, Christians are able to shoot from the hip, as it were. But so for me, there was one set of colleagues for whom I was kind of coming out as a Christian. And then much more recently, I feel as though I'm going through it all over again, because I'm kind of coming out as I hate the labels in many ways, but kind of as a charismatic Christian. And in a sense, the only way I personally can make sense of my rather ludicrous journey is in relation to talking about a God who actually sometimes calls you, not just a kind of God who you might meditate alongside in a sort of gently numinous way, but a God who actually can intervene. And that's, you know...
What was that moment for you, you know, at that... What? Just tell us a bit about...
Yeah.
How clear was that? How strong was it? What?
My vicar, I was part of a church which had a rather sort of bumpy recent ride, but I'd been getting more involved, and I was not remotely charismatic at this time, and I thought this church was kind of intriguing, but decidedly odd. But curiously, I was sort of drawn towards the centre of it, in spite of my many questions. I mean, this was not Anglicanism as I knew it. I had been a choral scholar in a Cambridge College chapel, and then I moved to London and joined a plant from Holy Trinity Brompton. So that is quite a journey, as some of you will appreciate. And he invited me out. I'd worshipped at the church for 5 or 6 years, but was very ambivalent about many of the things going on there, but tried not to be a destructive force. But I think he'd seen that, you know, through this rather difficult period, I'd been someone who did ask awkward questions. That was what I did for a living. But I hoped I did it from a place of sort of Christian sincerity. And so he said to me, we went out for a cup of coffee, I've got 2 questions for you. One, would you like to be church warden? Which, if you're an Anglican, it's one of the kind of 2, there are 2 church wardens who are the kind of senior lay people. And secondly, have you ever considered ordination? And I said, well, I'll think about the church warden, because I knew a few people in the BBC who were church wardens of their local churches. And I thought, well, although I was doing quite a lot of religion reporting, so I wasn't quite sure whether I could really get that past this kind of conflict of interest test. But anyway, I said I'd think about church warden, but, you know, no, not to ordination, because I feel my call is to work in mainstream broadcasting as a Christian. 2 days later, sitting with my wife one evening, and kind of from over here in my consciousness came the idea, well, why not resuming theological study and training for ordination now? And then the long descent into charismatic mania began, with me having a picture and a sort of sense of, if there was I'll stop in a moment, if you can imagine, the sort of scales that gold is weighed on, and it was as if in that moment there was a very, one side was working in broadcasting and the other was full-time ministry, and it was as if, in my imagination, in this picture from God, delete as appropriate, what had been a strong, clear weight in relation to life in broadcasting was suddenly hanging in the balance, and I faced a moment of decision, and that was February 2009, and I left the BBC the following July.
Who, again, out to the audience, who's had a clear sense of, and, Chris, you shared just brilliantly and honestly what that felt like in terms of a strong sense of God intervening at that point and really clearly presenting a path. Who else well, let's start with that side. So who's felt that very clearly? And again, if we can get a mic. Yeah, Julia, you've got a mic. Thank you. We'll come to everyone. What did that feel like for you, Julia?
It felt completely counter everything rational, is the way I would put it. It had happened to me once before in my life. In January 2012, I was perfectly happy with my job at the BBC. I loved it. I loved the work. I loved my team. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 months, a bit like Christopher described, it was almost like the balance shifted. And things that I thought was always my passion, which was to be in the BBC, it was almost like that kind of, in a counter-intuitive way, just changed to the point that I was even weighing up the other option and thinking, well, I'll only do that if I don't. I had to reapply for my own job, not uncommon in the cuts eras. And I kind of kept thinking, well, this will be plan B. But at the same time, there were various things going on that were making plan B, even despite people giving me a very realistic picture of all the negatives. It was almost like people told me the negatives, and that made me kind of in a weird way almost more convinced that that's what I should be doing.
Clear sense. Thank you for sharing brilliantly. And we had another, yes, at the back, Kate, I think. So I can see through the lights, yeah.
Hello, Tim. Hi.
Hi.
I was telling a little bit of my story about earlier on. I used to be with World Vision. I ran their global communications. And 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with advanced inoperable cancer and was basically told that my time was up. And God did something incredible in my life, and he did heal me. But during that time, I was given a passage from Psalm 118:17. I will not die, but I will live and declare the works of God. And I felt a very, very strong call at that time. A call, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, whether it was a call to ordination, which I am actually now exploring. I also wrote a book about my experience, about my faith experience, which is now a bestseller called Sea Change. And I ended up that brought all sorts of things. And I went back to World Vision because they were so wonderful to me when I was ill. And it was a safety thing. And I went back in, but over that year, the following year, I just felt like it didn't fit anymore. And a couple of things happened, and there was a bit of a management reshuffle. And eventually I realised that God was actually trying to prise my fingers off the side of the swimming pool so that I'd actually go and swim. And so January this year, I actually stepped out. And I decided I would just follow whatever God was telling me to do. And it's been incredible. I'm now going to be doing a show with TBN. I've got a consultancy working with churches and Christian organisations. And I am also exploring ordination. And it's just I had to be obedient. He wanted me to be obedient, but he had to prise my fingers off the side to get me to do it.
The image, isn't it? And I think we had one more. We've got probably time for one more. Yes, the lady just here on the front row. Thank you, everyone, for sharing so openly, honestly. And another example.
So this is just a quick one, really, about like God's voice being kind of obvious. So it happened for me, like actually 3 times, but I'll just say 2 of them. Like basically every job I've had, God has opened a door in a weird way. But anyway, I was working for Trussell Trust, who run food banks. Was a bit obsessed with it, worked there for 9 years. And then I watched a panorama about Ebola and just felt really sad about Ebola orphans. You know, normally you watch something on TV and you're kind of like, that's sad. And then the next crisis happens and you think, that's sad. And I couldn't stop thinking about it for months. So I was like, okay, God, if you want me to do something with this, will you just open a door? And then I sat next to a guy at my friend's birthday party, had told her that I thought this, and she sat me next to this person who turned out to be the chair of trustees for a charity called Street Child, which was leading the Ebola orphan response. And he was like, do you want to come to Sierra Leone? And I was like, maybe when? And he was like, in 3 weeks? I was like, okay. So I went to Sierra Leone, and I randomly got the same flight out and back as the CEO, who then, when I got back, said, do you want to work for us? And created a job for me. So I was like, okay. After a bit of time at Street Child, I was like, but I do really love IJM, which is International Justice Mission. But anyway, I'd been thinking about them, and then was like, God, I don't know if I should still be at Street Child or not, and just prayed, if you want me to do something else, will you just open a door? And the next week, I saw on Facebook, Communications Director for International Justice Mission UK, my favourite charity. So I was like, okay, God, if you want me to do that, can you get them to approach me? And that's a ballsy prayer, I realise. And that day, they got in touch and just said, I don't know if you've seen this job, but if there's any chance you'd be interested, our director would like to talk to you. So now I work for IJM.
Very good. Thank you for sharing. Round of applause. What about for anyone in the room who's been through career changes but hasn't felt it as obvious? Is there anyone who's been through that and they feel they look back and think, yes, they saw God's hand, but it wasn't necessarily sort of obvious at the time? Yeah, perhaps we just take one of those. And there's a lady here in the front row with the pattern blouse.
This is
Brilliant,
a slightly different tack, really. It's maybe a bit controversial, but for me, I was just having a great conversation in the break, actually, in here, about the kind of the consumer media culture we have, and there's so much choice, there's so much out there, so much opportunity. You've talked about it being quite confusing. And for me as a young woman, sort of searching that professional career, getting in on a news desk, and the question for me was for family. And actually the challenge was take the plunge and have a baby. And as you know, before I was 30, which for me and my friends, particularly most of the people I graduated with, they weren't even thinking about buying a house for the next 10 years. And that was really, really challenging. And it was challenging to think I could give up my future opportunities, I'd give up my full-time work, and when is the right time to do that? And for me, it was a wrestle for a couple of years and a prayer that was never answered. And a searching, God, is this right? Is this right? And obviously there's an intervention, an element of God's providence that has to come in that decision. And, it's a very personal thing. But I think it is a challenge for women, yet particularly the kind of millennials that we're sort of labelled as, for women that really want to work, really want to be professional and successful in such a fast-moving sector. And for me, that was a really, really big leap of faith that's been very rewarding and is still very challenging.
Well done for sharing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was going to say that's really touched my heart, because I took my plunge after I had my son. So, and for some people they might say I readjusted, but actually I made the decision not to go back to work after maternity leave. And so I think that's another aspect to this conversation as well, is that even as we evolve and we have more, I suppose, responsibility. So I've got a startup and a toddler. So pray for me.
We're into the final. You know what it's like with conversations.
Yeah.
They're just starting, and we're going to be out of time in a couple of minutes. But Tobi, there's a third bit which I thought we might explore, and it's a question to you, I guess, is when you were looking at making that really big change. Yeah. Who is it that you are asking? Who is it? Mentors? Is it family? Is it friends? Is it you alone on the side of the bed, you and God? Who did you involve?
I think for me, I had 3 strands. So I had myself and God and I had that conversation. I wanted that back in. I wanted to make sure that, we've discussed that call. Yeah. And then I had that personal sphere. So I spoke to my mum, I spoke to my husband, and we had that conversation about whether this is, something there. And then I had the professional in terms of the landscape, about where I wanted to go, what I wanted it to look like. I spoke to the partner of my firm. I spoke to some of the people who I had, worked with, and said, this is what I think could work. This is what I think we could do. And then I took a bit of a break, and then I got myself a mentor God, and then a mentor in my personal field and my professional. And I think that's really important. I think if you're going to take a plunge, you need to have someone personally that you can sort of cry to when sometimes it doesn't make sense. But I think it's important to have someone in the field, in the trenches, that knows the landscape of the market and knows what that works. So for me, that's worked for me since I've been doing it.
Thank you, Tobi. And Christopher, what about for you? Was there a mentor? Was it just your wife? Was it your wife and God?
I had lots of people telling me I was completely insane. Brilliant. I remember vividly meeting Elaine Storkey at Greenbelt and telling her with some excitement, and she said, that's terrible news. So there was slightly a sense of, some Christians were sort of invested in having this sort of BBC journalist who was also a Christian. And so I think you just have, my parents thought it was a terrible idea. They loved hearing me on Radio 4, and they had really quite concerns about, joining the C of E in that kind of way. So I think you have to have trusted friends, but try and be faithful. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? I was always terribly suspicious of these kind of, God opens doors, God invites me to apply. I was like, I don't have a faith like that. And then suddenly it kind of changed into one where I did. So, you know, it's a God of surprises, I think.
Thank you. And in the closing minute, I'm interested, who in the room, show of hands, has a mentor, sort of formal mentor that they would see? Okay, thank you. And who would say they have a really strong informal mentor, someone who, if they were coming to that point that they thought they were making a major change, they would say, "Oh, I know who I'm going to speak to about that." Who has that person? Yeah. And just perhaps one example, you know, someone who's got a mentor, the change that has made. One example, someone who will be brave and just share the change. Yes, sir. Thank you for offering. Just what's your name? Sorry, sir.
I'm Simon.
Hi, Simon.
Hi.
Tell us a bit about...
I've got the two Chris's. So my career sort of changed six years ago. I was commuting into London. I was head of comms at a major charity, and took the plunge and felt God call me. Didn't know what into, but didn't think I'd be starting my own business and being a partner in somebody else's business. Chris, the first Chris I've known for years and years. I was commuting in with him, knew him before I was commuting, and we'd always go in really, really early, go into St Pancras and grab a coffee, pray. He'd challenge me, I'd challenge him. I'm still training in London, and that relationship, you know, outside of travelling continues. But we make sure that if I'm coming into London, I come in with him, and we have that conversation. And it's become a two-way thing. He's an IT director. The other Chris I've met since. I've met him through an organisation in Milton Keynes, so I'd recommend, called Business Christians, that I've been going to for 3 years, where it's all about, you know, actually you're in business. God hasn't forgotten you. You can build kingdom through your business. And Chris is an incredibly talented physiotherapist and was a couple of years down the line in terms of setting up a business and some of the pitfalls. And we meet up on a regular basis. I think we're meeting up on the 27th just to chat and pray and to challenge one another.
Thank you so much for sharing. We are out of time. You know what it's like. The conversation just gets going, just gets interesting. It's over. What can I say? I wanted to thank you for being involved. A slightly different format, but I wanted, if we looked out and everyone just stared blankly and didn't put their hands in the air, then it'd be a terrible tragedy. So we wanted to thank you for taking part. And I think thank you to the sound guys, because they never knew who was going to be saying what at any one time. But they did it brilliantly. So a thanks to you and a thanks to the sound guys.